Make sure to listen carefully, because this might change everything. First of all, the title is not clickbait. We have reasons to believe Venezuela might actually be planning an attack on the 25th of January, and this whole thing was enabled by the US. In this video, I will explore what role the United States played and is about to play in this whole thing. I will go over the Venezuelan referendum that took place on the 3rd of December. I will explain what a war for Esequibo will look like and how it might be disastrous for the future of world peace. Then finally, I will tell you what has to be done for chaos to be avoided. For the people watching from Guyana or with friends or family there, I know the idea of war might seem terrifying, and you might not even want to entertain it. But as the Vice President and President of Guyana themselves have said, Guyana should be prepared for the worst case scenario. The referendum from the 3rd of December was allegedly 95% in favor of incorporating Esequibo, and the Venezuelan government also claims that 10.4 million people voted, so around 50% of the 2.7 million eligible voters. Overall, even if we are to believe the Venezuelan government, only 45% of its voting population supports the annexation, but in my opinion, even if we have the number to 22.5%, we are still being generous. It was widely reported by non-Venezuelan sources that almost no one showed up to the polls. People unsupportive of the regime didn't even show up to say no, since they saw the mere participation in the referendum as endorsing the Maduro government. The referendum was at first seen as an assessment of popularity by the Venezuelan government, since the United States is pressuring them to have a free election in 2024. You might think the low participation is good news, but it's quite the opposite. Now Maduro knows his chances for re-election are slim. This makes the government even more desperate and more likely to invade. The situation becomes more worrisome by the day. Maduro has announced he will enforce the results of the totally legit referendum, and in turn, President Ali of Guyana has reaffirmed Guyana's full commitment to defending its territories. The President of Guyana has met with the United States Secretary General and is planning to address the UN soon. Furthermore, Guyana has had meetings with many of their allies, but precise commitments haven't been announced. In the same time, the signs that Venezuela is not willing to back down have been piling. The announcement from Maduro he's preparing to enforce the results of the referendum, the defense minister ominously saying that Venezuela will not attack Guyana yet, and finally, what might be a nail in the coffin, an opposition leader excitedly saying Venezuela will declare war on January 25th. If the war is allowed to happen, the world will have to band together against authoritarianism or stay divided and drown in turmoil. The global response is so important because if Maduro is allowed to annex Esequibo, this will set a precedent for every authoritarian leader around the world. If the international community is going to let a war happen when they can easily prevent it, and if they let Venezuela annex a territory that allows them to keep their oppressive regime going, then the curtains of strategic ambiguity is fully lifted. Every dictator, from a small country in Africa to the communist superpower of China, will know that the West is too domestically challenged and dysfunctional to defend anything, and the world will fall into chaos. The lack of a US response at this point is baffling. This conflict would be 800 miles from Puerto Rico. This is essentially the United States' backyard. In comparison, the front in Ukraine is about 5,000 miles from the United States capital, and the Republicans and Democrats are busy bickering if they should send aid to it. Meanwhile, the democratic country of Guyana, which can be a major trade partner with America, is being essentially left to its own devices. Yes, the world has said it's behind Guyana, but Guyana doesn't need the world to be behind it. It needs the world to be in front of it, actively protecting it from Venezuelan aggression. Guyana doesn't just need guns and training, they need military personnel and capable volunteers. They need modern, advanced military equipment and an organized intervention from their allies. The West needs to make an example out of the Maduro government, to show to every malicious actor around the world that liberty and freedom will be defended. But why? Why would there be a war? Oil? Well, yes. If you have to simplify it, the reason is oil. Guyana's offshore oil reserves were the largest oil discovery in the Western Hemisphere this decade. And let me tell you, it might be the last major oil discovery. Liza 1 was the first significant offshore oil find in Guyana. It was discovered in 2015. 7 years ago. Why didn't Venezuela start the war then? Yes, the Venezuelan crisis was escalating, poverty and starvation were on the rise, Maduro was busy stealing elections and oppressing the opposition. But I mean, that's not so different from the situation Venezuela is now. You can actually argue that Venezuela is worse off this decade than the last one. So why now? Or simply, like Russia and China, Venezuela is in its last window of opportunity. If Venezuela doesn't attack now, they will not be able to do it all. Of course, Venezuela is working with a smaller window of opportunity which they actually didn't even have a few months ago. It roughly started with President Luiz Lula stepping into office in Brazil. Unlike his predecessor Bolsonaro, Lula doesn't have that staunch of a stance against Venezuela, and even though Brazil has deployed troops on the Venezuelan border, an intervention is not certain, but in October 2023, the door was truly opened for Venezuela. And who opened that door but the US? As I have mentioned in my previous video, the US lifted sanctions on Venezuelan oil, gas and gold. Of course, the whole White House verdict is that this was done to help Venezuela recover from its crisis and restore democracy with the release of political prisoners and a free 2024 election. However, if you look just a little bit deeper, the true reason easily reveals itself. And said reason is the Biden administration's Green New Deal. US domestic oil production has dropped around 2 million barrels per day, from 13 million barrels per day to around 11 or 12 million barrels per day. Don't get me wrong, an economic policy that will transition the US energy sector into a stable, emission-free industry is great. But how can you develop a stable energy sector when you're importing oil from military dictatorships like Venezuela? The US obviously hasn't fully transitioned its economy to suit self-sustaining energy sources, so demand for oil is just as high. This has led the United States to search for new trade partners from whom they can import oil. This is actually great for Guyana, who has experienced the largest economic growth in 2022 with 62% GDP growth. As I established in the previous video, this growth was caused by a discovery of a large oil reserve by ExxonMobil and Hess, who has now been acquired by Chevron. As you may imagine, importing oil is quite a bit more expensive than producing it domestically, and some economists have suggested this has imposed a $200 billion cost on the United States economy. This has obviously led to price increases, which are famously not good for re-elections. So the government did something to combat that. What did they do? Oh, they just used the strategic oil reserve of the United States military to lower prices, decreasing your military's fighting capabilities while funding dictatorships and terrorist regimes may not be the smartest move, if I say so myself. The United States is overall not exuding a lot of confidence in its commitments. Right now the Republicans are blocking funding to Ukraine, and it seems that the federal government isn't even aware of the situation in Guyana, or most likely they are pretending not to be due to lobbying from Chevron and other powerful businessmen. Chevron has bought Hess for $53 billion, which gave them Hess's portion of the offshore oil fields in Guyana. Chevron is highly intermingled with the Venezuelan elite, since a massive portion of their equities come from there. This has put Chevron as the de facto competitor of ExxonMobil in Guyana. I'm not saying ExxonMobil would do anything to help Guyana, the situation, but as far as I see, they would prefer to work with Guyana rather than with Venezuela. This is what CEO of ExxonMobil said in an interview on the subject.
On something else, if that's Guyana, I've been there, I've seen your production, how impressive it is. It's an important component of the overall company's production at this point. Sure. There's concern that Venezuela is going to try to basically, around this border dispute, invade a certain part of the country, take over a certain part of the country. What do you put in the context of what's been happening now for many, many years? Frankly, before we even started our first production out in Guyana, which is, there's been a border dispute. Venezuela's had the dispute. That is going through the International Court of Justice. There's an arbitration process that's happening. And so it is a matter between nation states and the international community. It's been ongoing. My expectation is that process will be respected. That's certainly what I see. Guyana has 1 million people. They can't defend themselves if the Venezuelans decide they want to do something. I'm not sure Guyana's standing on its own, to tell you the truth. I think, there are a lot of, we've all seen what happens when nation sovereignties are challenged and unilateral actions taken. I think the world and the outside community have been pretty sensitive to that. So my expectation is there's more support, more broad support in the international community to make sure that the right process are followed to resolve this dispute. From our perspective, we know what we need to do in country, develop those resources economically, environmentally, responsibly, and do what we've been contracted to do. That's what our organization's focused on.
Now, I think he isn't letting us see how much he knows about the situation, but I imagine with his connections and reach, and with the importance of this crisis to his company, he'll be more informed than any of us. That's why him being fairly positive towards an intervention in the conflict is good news, but then again, he could just be lying. I already discussed the two countries' militaries and their strategies in the case of war in my previous video. I will not be repeating that here, so if something sounds a little weird, I probably explain it in there. You might be wondering if the rumor that Venezuela will declare war on the 25th of January is true. Why would they wait so much? That's 53 days after the referendum. This is giving vital time for Guyana to prepare its military and strengthen its alliances. The most obvious explanation of this conundrum is that the opposition Venezuelan politician was just lying. However, another explanation might be that they still need time to prepare. This might sound weird at first, since oil was discovered in 2015 and presumably Venezuela would be planning to invade for a while now, so why would they be still preparing? possible explanation is that after the partial economic recovery of 2021 and 2022, Venezuela has been strengthening its military and increasing their stockpiles of food and ammunition. The October lift on sanctions would have also sped up the war preparations. To be honest, this doesn't really explain why they would hold the referendum with such a large gap from the invasion, but maybe that wasn't according to plan and they had to account for something else. So if we assume they do invade on the 25th, what will happen? Well, it all depends on the international response. If the global community phones in their support, this will spell disaster for the future. Guyana will be able to withstand the initial onslaught in a conventional war. This will lead to a war of attrition, which both countries are not suited to. Guyana has the economic and stability advantage, but Venezuela has the manpower and equipment advantage. This would be about a 50-50 chance of each country winning. But in this case, if China sees that the West isn't going to commit to helping Guyana, it might see an opportunity to become Venezuela's main partner, replacing Russia in the process. This would massively increase China's influence in South America, making Russia less relevant in the region, since the Russians are busy with their own war in Ukraine and will not be able to spare much for Venezuela. This would completely destroy the deterrence powers of the West, and it might even destroy NATO in the future. If the West continues to back down, this alternate future would probably see increasing conflicts around Israel, a war for Kosovo, and maybe even an attempted annexation of Taiwan and maybe even South Korea. As some of you might know, Guyana also has a border dispute with Suriname over the Tigray area. This dispute, since the Tigray isn't abundant in natural resources and it has no real infrastructure. The dispute originated during colonial times, when Guyana and Suriname were under British and Dutch rule respectively, but the border of the Tigray was thought to have followed the Kutari River, but further exploration found that the Kutari River actually flowed further within Guyana and the border follows the Corinthian River. This could provoke Suriname to join the war on Venezuela's side. A war on two fronts will cripple Guyana's defense and also ensure Venezuelan victory. However, things could be even worse if Venezuela succeeds in executing a non-conventional attack on Guyana. Guyana has actually been a recipient of a lot of Venezuelan refugees and immigrants. About 2,000 legal Venezuelan immigrants are in Guyana right now, but the real number of refugees could be reaching 100,000 people. This is as much as the Guyanese living in Esequibo. Of course, there is nothing wrong with people looking for a new and better life, keep their beliefs of ownership over Esequibo, and push Maduro's imperialist agenda. This could be seen as an intentional or unintentional civilian invasion on Venezuela's part. If Venezuela manages to sneak in special forces disguised as civilians, this would be disastrous for Guyana. The special forces could organize resistance in the country and might even secure a port or an airport for reinforcements. In this case, Guyana might fall within weeks. This would have the same disastrous effects for world peace as the previous scenario. Okay, you can say this is the bad ending, but what would be the good one and how can we achieve it? It's actually very simple. If the US reintroduces sanctions on Venezuela right now, the conflict would be avoided. This would show Maduro and his foreign supporters that the United States would not stand idly by in a war on a peaceful nation 800 miles from itself. However, this is looking unlikely to happen. As I have mentioned, the US is very internally divided, which is impacting its ability to maintain an effective foreign policy. An easy way to prevent or win a conflict is also if Britain, the de facto main country in the Commonwealth, decides to sail its navy over to Caracas. Venezuela is actually very easy to deter and defeat. It's a nation on the brink of collapse. The problem is, the West is stuck on their political divisions on domestic policy and is already supporting Israel and Ukraine. This has left the public disenfranchised and the politicians too busy exploiting their competitors' weaknesses. Worryingly, recent times are beginning to look eerily similar to the period before World War II. The West was in economic and political turmoil, the US was isolated from world politics, and authoritarian leaders were banding together. I truly hope the situation can de-escalate soon, so we don't have another World War II. With that said, you can click here if you want to see my first video on this subject, where I explore the historical background and go a little more in depth on what the United States can do. If not, you can watch this video instead.